It was only a few minutes past 9 when the silence in that small apartment began to feel unnatural. The window was open, letting in the cool May air. But the room itself was heavy, unnervingly still. On the floor lay a young woman, her body motionless, her phone just inches away from her outstretched hand, as though she had tried to reach it one last time. Her wide eyes seemed frozen in a final plea. Glassy, staring into nothing. The officer's flashlight beam trembled slightly as it passed over her. It was clear. This was no accident. No sudden illness. This was an act of pure violence. Her name was Nina Pop, just 28 years old, known throughout her community for her warm smile and easy laugh. Now, she was gone. But how did a cheerful Sunday night in a quiet Missouri town spiral into such horror? To answer that, we need to step back before the police sirens, before the flashing lights, before the name Joseph Cannon ever entered the headlines. Because the story of Nina Pop didn't begin with her death. It began with her life, and the courage it took to live it. Nina was the kind of person people remembered after only meeting once. She didn't have wealth, didn't hold a powerful job, but she carried something rarer: the ability to make others feel at ease. In a small town like Sikeston, Missouri, where everyone seemed to know each other's business, Nina stood out not because she tried to, but because she refused to dim who she was. She was a black transgender woman. For Nina, that meant every day required a choice. She could shrink herself to fit into others' expectations, or she could face the world exactly as she was. She chose the latter, with an open smile and a brave heart. On Facebook, her posts showed simple joys: time with her family, laughs with co-workers, the little triumphs of someone building her independence, step by step. Her job at a local fast food restaurant might not have been glamorous, but it mattered to her. It kept her steady, gave her routine, and allowed her to plan for the future she wanted. A small house of her own, more stability, maybe even the chance to mentor younger people in her community. Nina dreamed quietly, but she dreamed nonetheless. Yet beneath her easy laughter, those closest to her knew she sometimes felt watched. A glance that lingered too long. A shadow where one shouldn't be. In a town like Sikeston, being different meant being noticed, and not all attention was safe. But Nina rarely spoke about those fears. She wanted to focus on hope. That Sunday, May 3rd, 2020, had started like any other. She worked her shift, came home, and settled into the comfort of her modest apartment on South New Madrid Street. The day had been warm, but the evening brought a cooling breeze, and she cracked the window to let it in. She probably thought it would be just another night. Maybe she planned to call a friend, maybe she'd scroll through her phone before bed. But that night was different, because someone else had plans too. His name was Joseph Cannon, 40 years old, from Poplar Bluff, a town not too far away. Public records didn't say much about him. A few disturbances, a couple of fights, nothing that marked him as capable of the kind of violence he was about to unleash. How did their paths cross? Was it a chance encounter? A relationship gone sour? Or had he sought her out with intent, carrying a hatred he barely concealed? Police would later struggle to answer those questions. What is known is that he appeared at her apartment that night. The door creaked faintly, breaking the stillness. Nina may have looked up, startled, confused. Did she know him? Was this an expected visit that turned suddenly wrong? Or the moment a stranger forced himself into her home? What followed was fast, brutal, and merciless. A knife glinted under the pale light. The walls of the small apartment absorbed the sounds of a desperate struggle. Neighbors later said they heard muffled thuds, something they couldn't quite place, before everything fell quiet again. By the time it was over, Nina lay still on the floor, her life stolen in seconds. Hours passed before anyone realized what had happened. It wasn't until a neighbor, worried about strange noises and the eerie silence that followed, peered through the door and glimpsed a figure on the ground. The 911 call came in. Officers arrived, and what they found was a crime scene so deliberate, so violent, that one officer later admitted the thought that ran through his mind was chilling. This wasn't random. This was meant. Forensic teams began their careful work. Blood evidence, fingerprints, a phone lying nearby. Step by step, they pieced together the fragments of a night that ended in unspeakable loss. And soon, a name surfaced. Joseph Cannon. His DNA, his prints, his presence at the scene undeniable. But if Cannon was the who, the why remained tangled. To many in the LGBTQ+ community, the motive seemed obvious. Nina wasn't just murdered. She was murdered because of who she was. Her death became another haunting addition to the growing list of Black transgender women violently taken in America. Each case underscored a cruel reality. Living authentically, for them, could mean living at risk. Yet prosecutors hesitated to label Nina's case a hate crime. Missouri's laws offered little clarity, and without an explicit declaration, the motive stayed obscured. The silence around it made her friends and family angrier. To them, refusing to call it what it was felt like a second act of violence, this one from the very system meant to deliver justice. As for Cannon, when he was finally arrested almost 2 weeks later, he gave nothing away. No confession, no explanation. Just a cold, empty stare, as if what he had done was simply an act to be endured, not reckoned with. And so, the questions lingered. Did Cannon know Nina before that night? Did she trust him enough to let him in? Or did he discover her identity in the most dangerous way possible, and decide, in that split second, that her life had no worth? What really happened inside that apartment remains a puzzle. The missing pieces locked away in silence, and that silence echoes, long after Nina's final breath. There's so much more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The apartment was quiet again, but the silence was deceptive. It was the kind of quiet that arrives only after chaos has ripped through a space. Officers moved slowly, their boots brushing against scattered objects as they worked to secure the scene. A handbag was still sitting on the table, a reminder that Nina had only just arrived home when her life was taken. Her body lay at the center of the room, and even to seasoned investigators, the brutality was shocking. Each wound told the same story. There had been no chance to escape, no time to fight back. The crime felt deliberate, as though the attacker had come with a purpose, and wouldn't leave until that purpose was complete. In those first hours, every detail mattered. Officers collected fingerprints from the doorknob, pulled fibers from the carpet, photographed the position of every overturned object. They knew a single overlooked clue could mean the difference between a solved case and one that would haunt the town forever. But in a small town like Sixton, Missouri, murders didn't usually happen this way. That fact alone sent a ripple of unease through the investigators. Neighbors began gathering in the hallway, their voices hushed, their eyes wide with disbelief. Nina's name traveled quickly, whispered from one trembling mouth to another. Some said they'd heard something strange earlier that evening, muffled footsteps, a thud, but dismissed it at the time. Others remembered seeing a man nearby, though no one could give a clear description. Those fragments became the first pieces of a puzzle the police desperately needed to solve. Interviews stretched late into the night, each neighbor asked to recall every detail, no matter how small. A stranger's car parked outside, a shadow near the stairwell, a voice raised in anger. But what investigators wanted most was time. Time to pull the chaos of the night into order before the trail grew cold. The next step was technology. In larger cities, camera footage is everywhere, but Sikiston had only a few places under surveillance. Investigators visited gas stations, convenience stores, and small shops within walking distance of Nina's apartment. Hours of grainy footage were rewound, paused, and studied frame by frame, and then, one video made them pause. A man in a dark jacket, walking briskly, his head tilted low, as if to avoid being seen. His presence near Nina's apartment around the time of her murder was too precise to ignore. At the same time, forensic results were starting to trickle in. The fingerprints on the doorknob weren't Nina's. The DNA lifted from her apartment, mixed with her own blood, belonged to someone else entirely. And when those samples were entered into the state database, a name returned. Joseph Cannon, a 40-year-old man from Poplar Bluff. Cannon's background wasn't spotless, but it wasn't extensive either. Minor offenses, disturbances, a few fights. He wasn't a career criminal, but he was known, and now, his DNA placed him inside Nina's apartment the night she was murdered. Investigators dug deeper, pulling Cannon's phone records. Location data showed his device had pinged near Nina's home on the night of May 3rd. Messages from Nina's phone revealed she had been in contact with several men outside her immediate circle. Among them, one stood out. Cannon. The pieces were aligning, but a crucial question remained. Why? By now, the LGBTQ+ community across Missouri had begun to hear about Nina's death. Advocacy groups demanded answers, fearing what many already suspected, that this was another hate crime, a violent act rooted in the intersection of race and gender identity. For investigators, the possibility weighed heavily. The brutality, the suddenness, the silence Cannon kept even after his arrest of everything hinted at a motive deeper than impulse. But without concrete proof, they couldn't declare it hate-driven. Instead, they worked with what they had, evidence. And soon, the case against Cannon grew stronger. Witnesses came forward. One said they'd seen him in Dexter, Missouri, just hours after the murder, behaving strangely as though trying to hide. Another described his demeanor as restless, anxious, like a man who had something to conceal. When the crime lab confirmed that Cannon's DNA and fingerprints were on multiple objects in Nina's apartment, including the knife used in the attack, there was no room left for doubt. On May 15th, nearly 2 weeks after Nina's death, police moved in. Cannon was arrested in Dexter. He offered little resistance, showing no emotion, his face blank as though what had happened was already behind him. At the press conference that followed, the police chief praised the community. Dozens of tips had poured in, each one helping investigators connect the dots. Outrage over Nina's murder had transformed into action. The suspect was in custody. Justice, at least in part, had been served. But the story didn't end there, because while Cannon sat in a cell, silent and unreadable, one truth remained locked away. What had actually happened between him and Nina in the final hours of her life? Did they know each other before that night? Was there trust between them, shattered in an instant? Or was Cannon a stranger who discovered something about her identity and chose violence in response? The evidence told police how Nina died, but it never revealed why. And so, even with Cannon behind bars, the most important piece of the puzzle was missing: the motive. Without it, Nina's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a symbol of something larger, an echo of a crisis affecting transgender women across America. Because if Cannon killed her because of who she was, then Nina's case was not only about one man's cruelty. It was about a society still struggling to protect those most vulnerable. The community grieved. They demanded clarity. They wanted the court to name it for what they believed it was: a hate crime. But authorities hesitated. Missouri's laws offered no clear path for such a charge, and prosecutors avoided making promises they couldn't uphold. And in that silence, outrage grew louder. Nina's friends remembered her not as a victim, but as the smiling woman who lit up every room. Her neighbors remembered her as the one who always offered help, even when her own life was difficult. For them, her story wasn't finished until the truth about why she died was spoken aloud. But that truth never came. And with Cannon refusing to explain, the question that hung in the air was the one everyone dreaded most. Was Nina Pop killed simply for living as her true self? There's more to this story, and the unanswered questions only grow darker from here. If you want to know what happened when Cannon finally faced trial and how the community responded, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. When Joseph Cannon walked into the courtroom for the first time, everything about him seemed designed to unsettle. Dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, his face expressionless, he avoided the cameras with a blank stare. But what struck observers most was the absence of remorse. He didn't fidget, he didn't look nervous. He didn't even seem to acknowledge the weight of the accusations pressed against him. For Nina's family, her friends, and the LGBTQ+ community watching from the benches, that silence was almost unbearable. Here sat the man accused of cutting short the life of a young woman who had been beloved, radiant, and full of dreams. And yet, he gave nothing away. Not anger, not sorrow, not regret, just emptiness. The prosecutor began with facts, laying them out one by one with the precision of a surgeon. DNA evidence tied Cannon directly to Nina's apartment. His fingerprints were found on the doorknob and on the weapon itself. His phone records placed him near her home on the night of May 3rd. Surveillance footage captured a man in a dark jacket, his face lowered, walking quickly near the complex. Witnesses identified that man as Cannon. Piece by piece, the picture came into focus. He had been there. He had attacked. And he had left Nina to die alone on her living room floor. But the trial wasn't just about proving what happened. It was about trying to understand why. The defense, faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, tried to cast doubt. They argued that the prosecution couldn't prove premeditation. Maybe Cannon hadn't gone to Nina's apartment intending to kill. Maybe something had happened between them, an argument, a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. At one point, they even suggested that a third party might have been involved. Perhaps someone else had been in the apartment that night, leaving behind their DNA, their fingerprints, but investigators quickly dismantled that theory. Every piece of physical evidence pointed to Cannon alone. Still, the question of motive lingered like smoke in the courtroom. Did Cannon know Nina before that night? Was this a crime of passion, or was it something far darker: hatred, intolerance, prejudice, boiling over into violence? For the LGBTQ plus community, that question wasn't theoretical. To them, the answer was clear. Nina wasn't just killed. She was killed because she was a black transgender woman. Activists filled the courthouse steps, holding signs that demanded justice not just for Nina, but for every trans woman whose life had been stolen. On social media, hashtags bearing her name spread, her smiling face shared across the country. Each post carried a dual weight, mourning her death and warning others of the danger that still existed. Inside the courtroom, Nina's family and friends listened as the defense tried to minimize the crime, and their grief turned to anger. To them, reducing her murder to a tragic misunderstanding was a second act of violence, one that erased the reality of what it meant to live as Nina did, proudly and openly, in a world where that choice was dangerous. But the court had limits. Missouri law, at the time, lacked a clear framework for classifying crimes against LGBTQ+ individuals as hate crimes. Prosecutors, cautious and restrained, avoided making a claim they knew the law wouldn't support. Instead, they focused on what they could prove: second-degree murder and armed criminal action. For many, that decision was devastating. It felt like the system was refusing to name the truth. By sidestepping the hate crime question, the court seemed to imply that Nina's identity, the very thing that may have put her in harm's way, didn't matter. And so, the trial became two parallel stories. One, inside the courtroom, where the law spoke in the language of evidence and charges, and one outside, where Nina's community spoke in the language of grief, anger, and the demand for recognition. Throughout the proceedings, Cannon remained silent. He didn't testify. He didn't explain. He sat there as the details of Nina's final moments were laid bare, as her friends broke down in tears, as experts described the brutality of her wounds. He never once turned to her family, never once acknowledged the life he was accused of destroying. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Cannon was convicted of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The sentence was heavy, likely enough to keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. But for many, the moment was bittersweet. Yes, the man who had taken Nina's life would face justice, but the deeper truth that she may have been killed out of hatred for her very identity remained unspoken, unrecognized by the system. Afterward, Nina's family gathered outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters. They wept. They hugged. They thanked the community for standing with them, but their grief was raw, and their voices cracked as they asked the question still left unanswered. Why? Why did Cannon walk into her apartment that night? Why did he bring a knife? Why did he decide, in that terrible moment, that Nina's life was his to take? And perhaps most painfully, would the truth ever be known? Because Cannon never spoke, the silence became its own kind of confession, a refusal to explain, a refusal to humanize the woman whose life he had ended. And that silence echoed beyond the courtroom walls, leaving a scar on the community and a wound in the fight for justice. For the LGBTQ+ community, the case became a symbol, a reminder that laws were still catching up to reality, that safety was still a privilege, not a guarantee, and that living authentically could still be dangerous. For Nina's friends, the trial wasn't closure. It was just another chapter in the grief they carried daily. Her absence was everywhere: in the empty seat at family dinners, in the quiet moments where laughter should have been, in the phone calls that would never come. The court had answered who. It had answered how. But it had left the most important question untouched. Why? And that unanswered question lingers still, haunting those who loved her. Because if the truth behind Nina's death remains locked away, then how can anyone truly believe that justice was served? The silence around Cannon's motive only deepened the pain and set the stage for a larger battle, one that extended beyond a single trial. If the courts would not call Nina's murder a hate crime, then the community would demand change themselves. But could the outrage over one woman's death become the spark that forced society to face its failure? Or would her story fade into the long, painful list of names too often forgotten? There's still so much more to uncover, and what comes next reveals the limits of justice and the power of a community that refused to stay silent. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Do you want me to continue with part 4, the aftermath, the wider societal response, and how Nina's death became a rallying cry for the Black trans community? The gavel had fallen, the courtroom emptied, and Joseph Cannon was led away in shackles. On paper, justice had been served. The man convicted of murdering Nina Pop would spend decades behind bars, but for those who loved her, there was no relief. Nina's absence was everywhere. In her mother's kitchen, where her laughter had once echoed. On her siblings' phones, where her cheerful check-in messages would never appear again. In the small apartment on South New Madrid Street, which now stood quiet, the shadows still carrying the memory of that night. But Nina's story did not end in silence. It began to grow, reaching far beyond Sikeston, Missouri. News of her death spread across the country within days. For many, the details were chilling but not surprising. The year 2020 had only just begun, and already advocates were warning of rising violence against Black transgender women. Too often, their names appeared in headlines only after tragedy. Too often, their stories ended in sudden, brutal ways. Nina's murder was not an isolated case. It was part of a devastating pattern, an epidemic of violence that advocacy groups had been documenting for years. According to national statistics, transgender women of color faced the highest risk of fatal violence, often targeted because of both their gender identity and their race. When Nina's photo began to circulate online, her radiant smile seemed to pierce through the noise. To her community, she was not just another statistic. She was a person, a daughter, a friend, a woman who wanted stability, who dreamed of owning a house, who worked long hours but still found time to share joy with the people around her. Her death became a rallying cry. Across social media, her name trended. Hashtags demanding justice carried her story to thousands of strangers who had never met her, but now felt connected to her. Black transgender activists spoke out, emphasizing that Nina's murder reflected a larger truth, that living authentically, for women like her, came with an unspoken price. At vigils held in her honor, candles flickered against the night sky. Friends and strangers alike gathered, holding posters with her name, repeating the same words. Say her name, remember her, don't let her be forgotten. In those moments, grief was transformed into resistance. But behind the chants and speeches lay an uncomfortable truth. The justice system had refused to label Nina's murder a hate crime. To prosecutors, it was second-degree murder. Nothing more, nothing less. For many, that refusal was its own wound. By sidestepping the question of motive, the system seemed to erase the deeper reality of Nina's death. It was not just that her life had been taken, but that her identity may have been the very reason she was targeted. Her friends asked, over and over, Why won't they say it? Why won't they call it what it is? And the silence was louder than any verdict. In Sikeston, life resumed its small-town rhythm. But things were not the same. The fast food restaurant where Nina worked felt different without her energy behind the counter. Neighbors avoided walking past her old apartment, unable to shake the memory of flashing police lights and the rumors that followed. For some, her death became a reminder of vulnerability, proof that danger could find anyone, even in a place that seemed safe. For others, it became a call to speak up, to confront prejudice in their own circles. Conversations about identity, acceptance, and safety, once whispered, began to move into the open. But those conversations were not always easy. Not everyone wanted to face the truth. Not everyone wanted to acknowledge that Sikeston, like so many other towns, had failed to protect one of its own. Beyond Missouri, Nina's story added fuel to a growing national movement. 2020 would soon be marked by waves of protest, not only against violence toward the transgender community, but also against systemic racism more broadly. In that larger storm, Nina's name became part of a chorus, her story woven into the demand for justice and equality. Activists pointed to her case as evidence of the urgent need for change. Stronger hate crime laws, greater protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, more accountability from law enforcement, and most importantly, acknowledgement that the violence wasn't random but part of a much darker, deeply rooted pattern. In speeches, her name was said alongside others trans women who had been murdered that same year, their faces appearing on banners and posters, their stories carried through marches and rallies, each name a reminder, each life a warning. For Nina's family, the activism was both comforting and painful. They were grateful that people cared, that their daughter's name had become a symbol, but at the same time, they wished for something simpler, that she were still alive, still walking into the kitchen with that radiant smile, still calling on the phone late at night just to say hello. Her mother once said through tears, everyone loved her. Those words, simple and raw, became a refrain on social media, repeated again and again by those who wanted to honor her memory. But love, no matter how powerful, could not bring her back, and so the unanswered questions continued to haunt those left behind. Did Joseph Cannon choose Nina at random, or had he planned it? Did he feel betrayed upon discovering her identity? Or did he arrive at her apartment that night, already intent on violence? No one knew. Cannon never explained. The trial never revealed it. The silence persisted, and that silence left the community in a painful place. Because without motive, without acknowledgement, Nina's story remained unfinished. Her death was recognized by the courts, but the truth behind it was left in the shadows. In the end, Nina Pop's legacy became larger than her life. She was remembered not only as a daughter, sister, and friend, but also as a symbol of resilience, of visibility, of the dangers that come with living authentically in a world still unwilling to accept difference. Her murder was a personal tragedy, but it was also a mirror, reflecting the violence that Black transgender women face every day. And it left behind one chilling question, whispered at vigils, shouted in protests, and felt in the quiet moments of grief. If Nina could be killed in her own home, what safety is there for anyone who dares to live as their true self? Nina's death shook her community to its core, but her story did not end there. In the next part, we'll look at how her name became a rallying cry, and how the fight for recognition and protection pushed far beyond Missouri's borders. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it. In the weeks after Joseph Cannon's conviction, the small town of Sixton tried to return to its quiet rhythm. But beyond the borders of that town, Nina Pop's name was echoing in places she had never set foot. Her face smiling, warm, unmistakably full of life, was printed on posters carried through marches. Her name was chanted at rallies, lifted alongside others whose lives had been cut short. And for the transgender community, especially Black trans women, her death felt like both a personal loss and a collective wound. Because Nina was not alone. She was one among dozens of transgender women murdered in 2020 alone, a year that would become one of the deadliest on record for the community. In May of that year, as the country erupted in protest over the murder of George Floyd, Nina's name appeared on banners carried through the streets. The marches were not just about one man's death in Minneapolis. They were about a system, about lives stolen again and again without accountability. At vigils, speakers drew the connection clearly. Black lives were under attack, and within that, Black transgender lives were doubly at risk. To some, Nina's story seemed invisible in the wider news cycle, drowned out by headlines of police brutality. But within LGBTQ+ spaces, she was a symbol. Her death underscored the message that justice was incomplete unless it included everyone. Say her name, they insisted. Because saying her name meant she was not forgotten. But the reality was harsher still. For many Black trans women, Nina's death felt less like an isolated tragedy and more like a prophecy of their own fears. They spoke of walking home at night with keys clenched tightly in their fists, of avoiding eye contact with strangers who lingered too long, of weighing the risk of honesty in every interaction, whether revealing their identity would spark curiosity, cruelty, or violence. Advocates pointed to statistics. Black transgender women were not only at higher risk of violence, but also more likely to live in poverty, more likely to face discrimination in housing and healthcare, more likely to be left vulnerable by the very systems meant to protect them. And so, Nina's name became shorthand for all of it: the injustice, the invisibility, the daily risk of simply existing. Her murder also reignited debates over hate crime laws. Across Missouri, activists demanded change. If prosecutors couldn't or wouldn't recognize Nina's murder as a hate crime, then the law itself needed to be rewritten. Community leaders held forums, nonprofits issued statements, social media campaigns spread awareness. And through it all, Nina's smiling face remained the symbol. But change came slowly, if at all. Politicians offered condolences but little concrete action. Authorities insisted they needed proof of motive before labeling a crime as hate-driven. And Joseph Cannon? He remained silent, offering no explanation, no words, no closure. It was as if the system itself was conspiring to leave the truth buried, unspoken. Still, Nina's story refused to fade. Artists painted murals in her honor. Writers dedicated essays to her life. Her family, though devastated, continued to speak her name, determined not to let her become just another statistic. Friends shared memories online, her infectious laugh, her kindness, the way she could make a hard day lighter with just a few words. One friend wrote, "Everyone loved her. And that's why it hurts so much. Because if someone like Nina isn't safe, who is?" That question lingered in the comments, repeated again and again by strangers who had never known Nina, but now carried her story in their hearts. As 2020 wore on, her name joined a growing list recited at vigils across the country. The list was long. Far too long. Each name followed by an age that was often heartbreakingly young. Each name was a reminder that the violence was not stopping, that safety was still fragile, that justice was still incomplete. Nina's murder was not the first, and it would not be the last. But the outrage her death sparked helped push the conversation forward. Slowly, lawmakers began to face pressure. Advocacy groups gained momentum. National outlets, once silent, began covering the epidemic of violence against transgender people with greater urgency. Her death, horrific and senseless, had become a catalyst. And yet, for all the speeches, the rallies, the headlines, the pain remained sharp and personal. Her family still sat an empty place at the table. Her friends still scrolled through old messages, unable to delete them, unwilling to let go. Her town still whispered her name in the quiet moments, haunted by the knowledge that such violence had come so close to home. Justice had been served in the courtroom, yes. But justice in the broader sense. Justice that meant safety, recognition, equality that was still far away. The unanswered question hovered like a shadow. If the world could rally, could chant her name, could hold vigils and pass resolutions, then why were Black transgender women still dying at such alarming rates? What good was remembrance if it was not paired with change? Nina Pop's story had become larger than one person. But it was also still achingly small. A single life cut short. A single family grieving. A single apartment now filled with silence. And that contradiction between the symbol and the person was perhaps the cruelest truth of all. Because behind the chants and the posters, Nina was still just a young woman who wanted to live, to work, to build a future, and she never got the chance. The world had begun to say her name. But would it be enough? Would Nina's death spark lasting change, or would it fade into memory, leaving others to face the same fate? In Part 6, we'll bring Nina's story to its heartbreaking conclusion, looking at her legacy, the fight that continues in her name, and the haunting questions that still remain unanswered. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it. The trial was over. The protests had quieted. The headlines had shifted to other names, other stories. But for those who loved Nina Pop, the grief remained. Her mother still kept her photos close, unable to accept that her daughter's smile now lived only in memories. Her friends still scrolled through old messages, rereading her jokes, her words of encouragement, her plans for a tomorrow she would never see. And in Psychiston, her absence was felt in ways big and small. The fast food restaurant where she worked seemed emptier, the apartment complex quieter, the streets a little colder without her presence. Yet Nina's story refused to vanish. Her name had become a symbol, carried far beyond the small town where her life ended. At vigils across the country, people lit candles in her honor. They said her name alongside the names of other transgender women lost to violence. They marched with her photo, her radiant smile shining against the backdrop of grief and resistance. But Nina's legacy was more than a symbol. It was a question, a challenge, a demand, because what her death revealed was not just the brutality of one man, but the fragility of safety for anyone who dared to live openly as themselves. Joseph Cannon had been convicted. The system had done its part in the narrowest sense. It had caught the killer, processed the evidence, delivered a sentence, but it had not answered the deeper questions. Why was Nina targeted? Was it her identity? Was it hatred? Intolerance? Prejudice boiling over into violence? Or was it something else entirely? The silence around Cannon's motive was like a second crime. He never explained, never confessed, never offered a glimpse into the thoughts that led him into Nina's apartment that night. And without that truth, the wound felt incomplete. Justice, though official, felt unfinished. For Nina's family and community, that silence was unbearable. Because without motive, her death could not be fully understood. And without understanding, how could it be prevented from happening again? As the months passed, advocacy groups used her name as a rallying cry. They pushed for stronger hate crime protections. They called for better resources for transgender individuals, housing, employment, healthcare, safety. They demanded that Nina's story not be forgotten, not be reduced to a statistic on a long list of tragedies. And yet, the list grew. Each new name added to the tally was another reminder that the system was failing. Each vigil was both a remembrance and a warning. If nothing changed, more lives would be lost. Nina's death had become part of a much larger story, one that stretched far beyond her own life, one that spoke to the urgent need for change in America. Her friends remembered her as someone who loved deeply, who gave freely, who smiled easily, even when life wasn't easy for her. They remembered her dreams, a small house, a better job, stability, ordinary dreams, stolen in an extraordinary act of violence. One friend wrote, "Nina wanted the same things anyone else wants. To be safe, to be happy, to be free, to be herself. She deserved that much." And in that statement lay the truth of her legacy. Because Nina's story was not just about one woman's murder. It was about the value of a life too often dismissed. It was about the right to exist without fear. It was about the simple, human truth that everyone deserves to live authentically and safely. The silence of that night in May 2020 has never truly lifted. It lingers in the unanswered questions. It lingers in the absence of her laughter. It lingers in the community's grief. And perhaps that silence is the most haunting legacy of all, because it forces us to confront a painful truth. If justice does not include the why, if it does not name the prejudice, the hate, the deeper forces at play, then is it truly justice? Or is it just a pause, a holding pattern before the next name is added to the list? Nina Pop's story is not one with closure. It is one with echoes. Echoes in her mother's tears. Echoes in her friends' voices. Echoes in the chants at vigils and protests. Say her name. Remember her. Demand justice. And those echoes ask us, again and again, what kind of world are we building? If someone like Nina, a woman loved by all who knew her, can be murdered in her own home simply for living her truth? Her legacy is not only in her death, but in the challenge it leaves behind. To listen, to speak, to act, to refuse to let silence become complicity. Because if Nina's story teaches us anything, it is that justice is not just about punishment. It is about recognition. It is about building a world where no one has to fear for their life because of who they are. And until that world exists, Nina Pop's story will remain unfinished.